Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Burning, the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921, by Tim Madigan, narrated by Bill Andrew Quinn. Author's Note: I was oblivious to Tulsa's historic nightmare until that day in the winter of 2000 when Julie Heberlin, my editor at the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, stopped by my desk in the features department. It was then that Julie handed me a copy of a short wire service story about the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, which had been created a few years before to study a particularly deadly racial outbreak in 1921. As many as 300 people had been killed in the catastrophe, the wire story said, most of the victims black. A uniquely prosperous community of African Americans called Greenwood, 35 square blocks and literally thousands of homes, businesses, churches, and schools, had been obliterated by a white mob in Tulsa that numbered in the thousands. When I read the story, my reaction was the same as my editor's had been. How could we not have known about such a thing? If the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921 was as horrible as the wire story seemed to suggest, surely it deserved a place among the watershed moments in American racial history, alongside events such as the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Brown v. the Board of Education, Little Rock, the March to Selma, and Rosa Parks' historic resolve. Instead, the riot had never been mentioned in any history book I had ever read. Julie dispatched me to Tulsa a few days later. There I interviewed a handful of elderly African Americans, people who remembered the terrible hours of June 1st, 1921, when the whites swarmed over the railroad tracks separating white Tulsa from black. On that first trip I also met Oklahoma State Representative Don Ross, a veteran African-American legislator who had grown up in Greenwood and talked by telephone with a white historian named Scott Ellsworth, a Tulsa native who, like Ross, had devoted much of his life to restoring the Tulsa catastrophe to its proper place in history. My own article ran in the Star-Telegram on January 30th, 2000, beneath the headline, Tulsa's Terrible Secret. The dozens of Star-Telegram readers who called or wrote afterward, both black and white, young and old, had much the same reaction as my editor and myself. How could we not have known? In important respects, I was an unlikely candidate for such an assignment. I was born and raised in a small farming community in the north of Minnesota, where the only people of color were the Hispanic migrants who came up from Texas each summer to work in the sugar beet fields. By and large, through the first 20 years of my life, television was the only place I saw a black face. Racial issues were wholly irrelevant to me then, and continue to be even after the newspaper work took me to Texas, where I lived and worked for the first time with people from other cultural backgrounds. In retrospect, my lack of curiosity about those people and their experience in America was stunning. I will never forget my first night in Tulsa, having dinner with Don Ross in a quiet Chinese restaurant, and the look on his face as I asked questions such as, "What was it like for blacks after the Civil War?" Ross was stunned at first, then angry. "How can you not know these things?" he demanded. Then, his voice rising to the point that others in the restaurant looked uncomfortably over at our table, he said, "And you're one of the educated whites. If we can't count on you to understand, who can we count on?" For the rest of that night and for weeks thereafter, Ross called me ignorant white boy. I am pleased to say that Ross and I are good friends today. When my newspaper article appeared, he went so far as to dub me an honorary Negro. He has since retracted such blasphemy and in his more charitable moments now calls me a moderate where racial issues are concerned. I'm not kidding myself either. I am still ignorant, but after my recent journey into the darker corners of our past, one that began with my newspaper story and has continued with the research and writing of this book, I'm not nearly as ignorant as before. I will never be able to look at a black person the same way again. I think I'm beginning to understand. Until that night with Don Ross, I had never heard of historian John Hope Franklin, a native of Tulsa, as it turned out, or his book From Slavery to Freedom. At Ross's suggestion, Franklin's book became the launching point for my crash course into Black history, and I'm now of the opinion that it should be taught in every American high school. Until reading Franklin's book, I was only vaguely aware of the horrors of slavery. I was almost completely ignorant of the terror and hardship that came with emancipation, the murderous rides of the original Ku Klux Klan, the reign of Jim Crow, thousands of lynchings, racial hatreds that were not only tolerated, but widely condoned and endorsed at the highest levels of our society by people and institutions in the North and South alike, the revival of the KKK in the 1920s, and so on. Not long into my research, I realized that what happened in Tulsa in 1921 was scarcely an isolated event. It might have been the worst incident of its kind in our history, but almost every month, American newspapers of that time carried new accounts of racial bloodshed in another town or city, new atrocities perpetrated against Negroes by mobs of whites. Rather than an exception, I learned, what happened in Tulsa was a metaphor for that period of our history, those particularly ugly years that followed World War I, and for the Black experience in America in the century after the Civil War. In addition to From Slavery to Freedom, several other books were especially helpful in my quest to understand that history and to place the burning of Greenwood in its proper context. Chief among them were Wen Craig Wade's The Fiery Cross, The Ku Klux Klan in America, Only Yesterday, An Informal History of the 1920s by Frederick Lewis Allen, Joseph Cartwright's The Triumph of Jim Crow, Tennessee Race Relations in the 1880s, and The Unknown Soldiers, Black American Troops in World War I, by Arthur E. Barbeau and Florette Henry. I also relied heavily on independent scholar Paul Lee, who is as knowledgeable and passionate about these matters as any individual I've encountered. I never failed to be inspired by our long telephone conversations, which often stretched far into the night. Most of my research, obviously, focused on a particular moment in that wretched history, and my debt to those who helped me understand what happened in Tulsa cannot be overstated. Eddie Faye Gates, a member of the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, took it upon herself to befriend many of the more than 100 survivors of the burning that the commission identified after being created by the state legislature in 1997. Gates was also my tireless intermediary with those elderly people, both blacks and whites, who were burdened with their awful memories. Nonetheless, in every instance, I found the black survivors and white witnesses to be charming, gracious, and wholly accommodating. My profound gratitude goes out to black survivors George Monroe, Otis Clark, Eldoris Ector McConaughey, Venice Sims, and Wilhelmina Guess Howell, and to white witnesses Lee Sisko, Clyde Eddy, Philip Rees, Richard Gary, and Margaret Anderson. From our first telephone conversation, historian Scott Ellsworth has never been anything but generous with his time and accumulated wisdom. Ellsworth is chief among the handful of individuals, many of them white, whose courage and doggedness have helped wrest the burning of Greenwood from the shadows of history, and thus made this book possible. Ellsworth's book, Death in a Promised Land, The Tulsa Race Riot of 1921, was the first scholarly examination of the event ever published, and an essential roadmap in my own attempts to reconstruct what had happened. Equally valuable were taped recordings of Ellsworth's interviews, conducted more than 20 years ago with riot survivors who were teenagers or young adults at the time. In almost every instance, those individuals are deceased. Their preserved recollections now reside on tape in the Special Collections Department of the University of Tulsa's McFarland Library, where I spent several fruitful days following in Ellsworth's footsteps, eavesdropping on his conversations with survivors like Bill Williams, Seymour Williams, and Robert Fairchild. Also among the Ellsworth tapes was Wilhelmina Guess Howell's 1989 address to a Tulsa community group, a speech that included her own riveting account of the burning and a tour through her remarkable family history, dating to the Civil War. It is my great privilege to congratulate Ruth Sigler Avery for her attempts to discern and disseminate the truth about Greenwood's obliteration. In the spring of 1921, she was a little girl growing up in Tulsa in a wealthy white family, but she was old enough to be traumatized by what happened, and decades later, her lingering outrage inspired her to produce Fear, the Fifth Horseman, a documentary and anthology on the 1921 Tulsa Race Riot. Included in that unpublished work are transcripts of more than 15 interviews that Avery conducted in the 1970s and early 1980s with riot survivors, white witnesses, and a Klansman, all of whom are now dead. Avery's work informs this book more than any other single source, having allowed me a glimpse into the life of Tulsa shoeshine boy Dick Rowland, an insight into the prevailing attitudes of both whites and blacks, and having provided me with hitherto unknown details of the mind-numbing cruelty and horror. I am similarly grateful to Ed Wheeler, whose 1971 magazine article broke Tulsa's half-century of silence where the burning was concerned. Wheeler was equally generous with his time and recollections. My research went on to include dozens of conversations with descendants of Greenwood residents, most notably Jack Adams and his brother Don, and Obera Mann Smith and J.D. Mann, who shared family stories that had been passed down for generations, stories so crucial to my understanding of some of this book's most prominent characters. My reporting also included an exhaustive review of the Tulsa newspapers of that time, as well as publications such as the New York Times and other major national newspapers and periodicals that covered the burning in the days and weeks after it happened. A graduate school thesis written about the burning by Lauren Gill in the 1940s was similarly valuable, as were several magazine articles, National Guard duty reports of that time, hundreds of pages of court transcripts and legal depositions, and the final report of the Tulsa Race Riot Commission, which was presented to Oklahoma Governor Frank Keating and the Oklahoma legislature on February 28, 2001. The story that follows synthesizes what I learned over the course of a year from hundreds of sources. In most cases, descriptions and dialogue that appear in the book are taken directly from the recollections of survivors and witnesses, from newspaper accounts or legal documents. In some cases, I have taken the license of approximating dialogue for the purpose of maintaining the narrative. These instances are totally consistent with the character of the people involved as my research revealed them to be, and wholly true to the events as they unfolded in 1921. For me, work on this book has been a life-changing odyssey. Early in the process, I began to suspect that a crucial piece remained missing from America's long attempts at racial reconciliation. Too many in this country remained as ignorant as I was. Too many were just as oblivious to some of the darkest moments in our history, a legacy of which Tulsa is both a tragic example and a shameful metaphor. How can we heal when we don't know what we're healing from? I hope this book contributes in some small way toward that broader understanding. Such is the spirit in which it is written. Tim Madigan, March 2001, Arlington, Texas. Prologue. Like Judgment Day. For the rest of her life, and she lived a very long time thereafter, Eldoris Ector McCondici remembered the exact words of her mother. "Eldoris, wake up! We have to go!" Harriet Ector shrieked to her daughter on that beautiful spring morning of June 1st, 1921. "The white people are killing the colored folks!" The cloudless sky outside was still pink from the dawn, but with those words, Eldoris's drowsiness was gone in a blink, rendering her fully awake and trembling by the time she tossed aside the covers. The 9-year-old girl threw a dress over her head as her mother rushed her along, with scarcely time for shoes and socks, and followed her parents and older brother as they hurried toward the front door of their small home in Iroquois Avenue. White people? Killing the coloreds? Eldorus waited to shake free from the nightmare, but she couldn't. She turned her mother's words around in her young mind, trying to fit them together in a way that would make sense, but that didn't happen either. The days before had been so peaceful, boys and girls antsy because the end of the school year was just a few days away, but nothing else seemed amiss whatsoever. And white people? Eldorus never had reason to fear them before. Every morning since she could remember, her father had set out on foot, walking south through the Black Quarter where her family lived, the place called Greenwood. Then he crossed the Frisco Railroad tracks at the edge of the Negro community, stepping into the dream world of tall buildings and streetcars and big new stores and huge schools and fancy homes where the whites of Tulsa, Oklahoma lived. Every day, Eldorus's father clipped those white folks' lawns and weeded their gardens, and the rich whites brought her father cold drinks on hot afternoons, and gave him a ham at Christmas, and otherwise treated her father fine, at least as far as his young daughter knew. But most important, they also paid her daddy a nice wage. Eldorus was old enough to know that the salary Howard Ector earned across the tracks was the reason his family had their little house on Iroquois. It paid for their food, and 15-cent movies at the Dreamland Theater on Greenwood Avenue, for her dresses, even for a doll or two. And Eldorus knew the story was the same in almost every Greenwood household. Negroes toiling for white folks across the tracks, thousands of men and women joining Howard Ector on the same trek south to work as maids, or as mammies who suckled the white infants, or as chauffeurs, elevator operators, ditch diggers, landscapers, or shoeshine boys, taking the burdens from white Tulsans who got rich from the oil wells gushing just south of the city. Many Negroes disappeared into white Tulsa for days on end, swallowed up in the affluence like Jonah by the great whale, living in servants' quarters on the south side. Greenwood didn't see them until Thursday, the maid's day off, when the servants rushed back home over the tracks and donned their fanciest clothes to stroll the 2-block section of Greenwood Avenue where it ran into Archer Street, Deep Greenwood, as it was called. The maids and chauffeurs and gardeners and mammies ambled around for hours, past the sturdy brick drugstores, beauty parlors, newspaper offices, meat lockers, restaurants, jewelry stores, fine hotels, jazz joints, barber shops, skating rinks, and pool halls, all of them owned and run by blacks, past the offices of the lawyers and doctors, all of whom were Negroes too. The heavenly aromas of fried chicken, barbecue ribs, and collard greens filled the air, mixing with the notes of jazz and blues that poured into the street. Promenading. That's what they called the activity of those wondrous Thursday nights, walking and flirting, pausing to spend some of their hard-earned money on an ice cream cone, or a glass of lemonade, or a new hat, or on a snootful of bootleg liquor, then walking some more. Young men fought as the nights wore on and the moonshine flowed, and shot their guns into the air and sometimes at each other. But by and large, those nights were happy times, celebrations of what seemed possible for Negro people in America less than 60 years after the Civil War. So on those Thursday nights in particular, the Negroes could forget about the new brick skyscrapers, fancy cars, and big homes that belonged to the whites on the south side of the tracks. They could forget that blacks, whose sweat was certainly welcome there, couldn't shop in white stores, or see movies at white theaters, or ride in white railroad cars. They could forget that new laws had caused even the telephone booths in Oklahoma to be segregated. They could forget that whites had larger, nicer, newer schools with all the latest textbooks for their children. They could overlook all these things because of the promise of those Thursday nights. because Greenwood Negroes, probably more so than blacks in any other place in the nation, had everything they needed on the north side of the Frisco tracks. As far away as Chicago, blacks said the Greenwood Community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, was the top of the mountain for people of their race, a remarkable little city within a city, remembered over the decades as the Negro Wall Street of America. And even a child knew the money that Negroes like Eldorus's father earned from the whites made it all possible. But then, on that rosy dawn of June 1st, 1921, it all disintegrated with her mother's early morning words. The white people are killing the colored folks, and in the second that Eldorus poked her head out the front door, she knew it was true. She turned her head south as she stepped outside, looking toward deep Greenwood, the scene of all those festive Thursday nights. A massive black cloud of smoke billowed there now, nearly obliterating the rising sun. As her father pulled her from the house by the hand, she heard a terrible noise from the sky and looked up to see airplanes buzzing low. The little girl had seen the flying machines only a time or two before, and they were ominous creatures even then, but now as they roared above them, she heard the dull thuds of bullets hitting the ground around her feet like fat raindrops, and she realized that she and her family were being shot at from the air. She yanked free from her father then, racing in panic to a nearby chicken coop and pulling open the door. The terrified eyes of several Negro adults already crowded inside stared back at her from the shadows. Chickens cackled nervously at the intrusion. Eldorus pushed her way through the grown-ups and crouched in a corner of the coop and would have stayed there forever if her father hadn't appeared at the door, pulled her back outside, and dragged her off to the north to join all the others. For her family was certainly not alone in their flight. A great column of black people was hurrying north with them along the Midland Valley Railroad tracks that ran past her house, a sorry procession of thousands that stretched as far as Eldorus could see. Some were dressed only in bathrobes or nightclothes, having been flushed from their homes in the middle of the night by white mobs in the grip of the devil. "Come out, niggers," members of the mob called to them in their Greenwood homes that night. "Come out or die." So they rushed outside and headed north, many without shoes or socks. Women carrying wailing babies quietly wept to themselves. People hauled bundles of clothing on their heads. An old woman clutched a tattered Bible to her chest. A girl about Eldorus's age carried a little white dog beneath one arm. Some of the men cried too, or stared off to a place far away, as if looking for answers there. Parents dragged their older children along after them, just as Howard Ector now dragged his daughter. The old people shuffled along as best they could. Many of them were old enough to remember slavery, but nothing from those times compared to the horror of what was happening on this morning. The planes disappeared from the sky after a few minutes, so now and then someone in the procession took a moment to ponder the growing wall of smoke to the south. Beneath that cloud, their homes and all their earthly possessions were being incinerated. Back there, they had seen their neighbors tortured in the most hideous ways, or shot down in cold blood, or burned alive. Why? The question hung over the procession like the smoke from the fires behind them. All anyone knew was that a few days before, a white girl had accused a black boy of assault, which somehow caused Greenwood to be swallowed up by rage, as if every ounce of enmity that had been building up in the whites since the Civil War had exploded on their doorsteps. The white people are killing the colored folks. An angry white mob clamored at their heels. So Eldorus and her family and the rest of the Negroes fled for their lives up the Midland Valley tracks toward the wooded hollows and rolling hills to the north of town, where they might finally be safe. Looking around at the others, at the horror etched on the refugees' sunken faces, at the smoke behind her, Eldorus was reminded of something she had learned about in Sunday school. This was like Judgment Day. As she stumbled north with her family, she expected to see Jesus appear on his throne at any second, come to set everything right. But she never did. Each member of Eldoras's family survived that day, but so did the horror. Her mother's chilling words in the morning, the smoke, the crowds, the planes, the death and grief and destruction her family saw when they were allowed to return home a few days later. Somehow, their little house on Iroquois had survived, but most of the other buildings for 35 square blocks, almost every business, church, hospital, school, and home in Greenwood had been reduced by the mob to ash and rubble. A few days after the burning, Eldoris walked to Detroit Avenue on the shoulder of Standpipe Hill, where so many of the black doctors and lawyers and businessmen and school teachers had their large, beautiful brick houses. Now only an occasional wall or chimney still stood. On one surviving wall, a wisp of white curtain dangled from a window, tossing in the breeze. Eldoris somehow took that as a sign of God's love and hope. But the memories always stalked her, God's love and hope, or not. The memories stalked everyone. In the decades to come, few Tulsans on either side of the tracks spoke out loud of the great burning, as though the catastrophe was a secret that both blacks and whites conspired to keep. Indeed, people who moved to the city only a few years later might never have known that it happened at all. But whether it was discussed or not, no one who witnessed the events of those historic days in Tulsa could ever forget. 79 years later, almost to the day, on a cloudy spring morning in the year of 2000, Eldoris Ector McClondichie shuffled to a bookcase in the living room of her tidy Tulsa home, not far from the place on Iroquois where she grew up. She was an elderly widow now. She pulled 2 tissues from a box on the bookcase and sat down on her sofa, smiling weakly. By now, I know better to talk about that day without holding a few of these, Eldoris said. Chapter 1. Beyond Hatred's Reach. On a warm May night in 1913, in the shadowy lamplight of Greenwood's First Baptist Church, Mrs. Lucy Davis read the audience a short essay on love, and the Rollison sisters nervously stepped to the altar to sing a lovely duet. Men wearing expensive suits and white gloves, and women in their finest white dresses applauded politely. But those were the only quaint preliminaries to the primary attraction, one anticipated in the Greenwood community for days. Scarcely a spot in the pews was empty that night, for the principal speaker at the annual meeting of one of Greenwood's leading fraternal orders was none other than Captain Townsend D. Jackson, ex-slave, revered black lawman, and militia leader in both Oklahoma and Tennessee, a man who had cast off the shackles of slavery and now looked the white governor of Oklahoma straight in the eye without blinking. Or so Tulsa Negroes had heard. Just a few months before, Jackson and his family had moved to Greenwood from the Oklahoma town of Guthrie, preceded by Jackson's considerable notoriety, and his new neighbors were certainly anxious to hear for themselves the man's thoughts on the great racial questions of the day. That night at the church, they would finally get their chance. He was impressive enough to look at, a stately 6-foot fellow whose short, dark hair had gone mostly gray. Jackson was also what Negroes called a light, a mulatto whose creamy skin color gave rise to suspicions that he had been fathered by his Georgia slave owner in the 1850s, a common enough occurrence in those days. Little matter. As the Rollison sisters warbled their final note, Jackson rose and slowly stepped toward the pulpit, away from the front row pew where his wife and youngest son, the handsome young physician, Dr. Andrew Jackson, were sitting with him. As he did, Andrew J. Smitherman removed a piece of paper and pencil from his breast pocket and leaned forward in his own pew near the front, poised to capture Jackson's every word. Smitherman, a bulldog-like man, was the irascible editor of the Tulsa Star, Greenwood's leading publication and its most authoritative public voice. In the 8 years between that night in the church and the great...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?